Nobody moved to help him. The woman at the counter didn't even look up. Arthur Meade had been standing at the service desk for 4 minutes. He knew because he'd checked his watch twice, an old Seiko with a cracked crystal that he'd never gotten around to replacing. The lobby of the Pinnacle Auto Group's flagship dealership on Yonge Street was cool and bright, all polished marble and recessed lighting, the kind of place designed to make certain people feel welcome and others feel like they'd wandered in through the wrong door. Arthur had wandered in through the front door, the same one that had a man in a gray vest holding it open for the couple ahead of him, a pair in matching Lululemon who'd been immediately approached by 2 salespeople before they'd taken 3 steps inside. Arthur was wearing a canvas work jacket, the kind with the corduroy collar that gets softer the longer you own it. His jeans were clean but worn at the knees. He drove a 2009 Civic that he'd parked in the visitor lot around the back because the front spots were angled in a way that made him nervous about the door swing. The woman at the counter, her name tag said Brittany Coles, was typing something. She finished typing. She started typing something else. Arthur waited. He wasn't the type to make noise about being ignored. He had a particular kind of patience that people sometimes mistook for passivity. The kind that came not from weakness, but from having spent a long time watching what happened when you let situations unfold on their own. He'd learned more from staying quiet in a room than from talking in one. After another minute, a young salesman named Derek Foss approached from the side. He had the kind of posture that suggested he'd been told once that he was good-looking and had been coasting on it ever since. "Can I help you find something?" Derek asked. The tone was polite enough but had a ceiling on it. There was a version of that question that meant, "I'm here to help you," and a version that meant, "What are you doing here?" And Derek's was the second kind. "I'd like to look at the custom order process," Arthur said, "for the commercial fleet program." Derek's expression didn't change exactly, but something shifted behind it. "The fleet program," he repeated. "That's right. That's more of a corporate account thing. Do you have a business account set up with us?" "I'm looking to open one." Derek glanced briefly toward the back of the showroom, then back at Arthur. "Our fleet coordinator, she's pretty backed up this week. You might be better off calling the main line and scheduling something. I drove 40 minutes. "Right, I understand that, but without an appointment for fleet services. I don't need an appointment to look at what you have on the lot." There was a pause. Derek smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach anything. "Sure, absolutely. I'll grab you a brochure." He walked away and didn't come back. Arthur stood there for another 2 minutes. He looked around the showroom at the display vehicles. A black SUV on a rotating platform, a white coupe under a spotlight, a red pickup truck parked at an angle that made it look aggressive on purpose. He walked over to the pickup and looked at the specs sheet behind the windshield without touching anything. A woman in a blazer passed close enough that he could have gotten her attention. She didn't make eye contact. He went to the water station in the corner and poured himself a small paper cup of water and drank it standing up, looking at the lobby. He wasn't angry exactly. He was filing things away. Brittany Coles, who had never looked up, was now talking with a customer who'd come in after Arthur, a man in a dress shirt with a company logo on the chest. She was smiling at him. She had a nice smile. She just hadn't used it in Arthur's direction. Arthur put the cup in the recycling bin and took out a small notebook from his jacket pocket. Not a phone, an actual notebook, the soft-cover kind from Staples, with a pen tucked in the wire spiral. He wrote something in it and put it back. Then he left. He came back the next morning. He wore the same jacket, the same Seiko. He parked in the same spot around the back. This time he sat in one of the waiting area chairs near the window, the ones with the low cushions meant for customers having their cars serviced, and he watched the showroom floor for 45 minutes. He had a coffee from the Tim Hortons 2 blocks down, and he drank it slowly and watched. The morning staff trickled in. Derek Foss arrived at 8:43 and spent the first 10 minutes on his phone near the service entrance. Brittany Coles came in at 8:50, said something to a colleague that made them both laugh, then settled in at the counter and pulled up her screen. A senior salesperson, older, gray-haired, moving with the ease of someone who'd been there long enough to stop pretending, came in through the back and made a slow circuit of the showroom floor, adjusting nothing but seeing everything. His name, Arthur would learn later, was Ron Calloway. He was the kind of person who'd been in the business long enough to know what it looked like when something was off. Was noted Arthur sitting there and came over. Not hurrying, not suspicious, just noticing. "Morning," Ron said. "You waiting for service?" "No," Arthur said. "Just thinking." Ron for him the look of someone deciding whether to leave it alone. He sat down in the chair one over. "You were in yesterday," he said. It wasn't a question. "I was. Derek help you out?" Arthur picked up his coffee. He went to get a brochure. Ron was quiet for a second. "Right." He crossed his arms. "You looking at the fleet program? I'm looking at a lot of things." Ron didn't push. He had the particular stillness of someone who'd seen enough deals fall apart from over-talking to know when to be quiet. They sat there for a moment in a way that was almost companionable. "We've got a new fleet coordinator starting next month," Ron said eventually. "If timing is an issue." "It's not a timing issue," Arthur said. Ron nodded slowly. He stood up. "I'm here until 5 if you want to talk through specifics." He held out a card. Arthur took it and put it in his jacket pocket without looking at it. He watched Ron walk back to the floor. He watched the way Derek Foss clocked Ron coming from Arthur's direction, and then made a point of being busy near the premium models on the far end. He watched Brittany Coles handle 3 walk-in customers in the time he'd been sitting there. One immediately, one after a short wait, one whose questions she'd waved off to a colleague. He noted which one. He stayed another 30 minutes. He wasn't enjoying himself, exactly, but there was something clarifying about it. He was building a picture, and pictures took time. When he left, he stopped briefly at the counter. Brittany was between customers. "Excuse me," Arthur said. She looked up. There it was, the same half-second assessment that he'd seen the day before, the same invisible calibration. "Yes, I left something here yesterday. Small notebook. Has it been turned in?" She checked the lost and found drawer. A shallow tray under the counter. Nothing. "Sorry, nothing here." "That's all right," Arthur said. "Thank you." He walked out. He still had the notebook. He just wanted to see if she'd recognize him from the day before. She hadn't. Arthur Meade had grown up in Sudbury, the second of 3 kids, in a house where the heat came on in November and went off in March whether or not winter agreed. His father had worked at the Inco smelter for 22 years and retired with a bad knee and a company watch that he kept in the kitchen drawer. His mother had worked part-time at the credit union until she didn't need to anymore. Not because things got easy, but because she'd made them work. There was a particular discipline in that household about not talking about money as if it was the point of anything. You worked because work had dignity. You saved because uncertainty was real. You didn't show off because showing off was a way of asking people to think about you, and there were better things to do with other people's attention. Arthur had carried that with him across a lot of years and a lot of changes. He'd studied mechanical engineering at Laurentian, stayed in the region longer than most of his classmates, and then spent a decade doing things that didn't have clean titles. Consulting work, turnaround work, the kind of thing where someone hands you a problem that's too broken and too specific for the usual tools, and you figure it out anyway. He'd been good at it. He'd been better than good. The company he ran now was called Broadfield Industrial Partners. It was incorporated federally, had offices in Mississauga and Calgary, and managed a portfolio that included, among other things, 2 transportation logistics companies, a provincial aggregate supplier, and a 34% holding stake in the Pinnacle Auto Group, which was how he'd come to be standing in the dealership lobby on Yonge Street in a canvas jacket with a cracked watch. The Pinnacle board had been in discussions about a proposed expansion of the commercial fleet division, a significant capital allocation that would touch 3 provinces and require a renegotiation of several vendor contracts. Before Arthur would approve the allocation, he wanted to understand what he was actually approving, not in the abstract, not from a slide deck. He'd done that kind of work for 30 years, and he knew the gap between what a business looked like on paper and what it looked like from the inside of its own lobby. He'd seen companies get that gap wrong in both directions. He wasn't going to make the decision without looking. So he'd looked. He hadn't told the dealership he was coming. He hadn't told the Pinnacle executive team. He'd driven up from Mississauga in the Civic, parked in the back, and walked through the front door the same way a customer would. Because the customer experience was the business. It wasn't a subset of the business. It wasn't a branding consideration. It wasn't a line item you handed to a VP of marketing. It was the whole thing. It was what the business actually was when you stripped away the messaging. What he'd seen was not catastrophic. It wasn't fraud. It wasn't regulatory exposure. It wasn't anything that would show up on an audit. It was subtler than that, and in some ways subtler was worse because subtler was harder to fix and easier to ignore. He'd seen a culture, not the culture that was described in the employee handbook, which he'd read on the drive up. A different one. The one that existed in the gap between Derek Foss going to get a brochure and not coming back. The one that existed in the half-second assessment Brittany Coles made before deciding how to spend her smile. The one that existed in the way an entire showroom floor had moved around a man in a work jacket as if he were furniture. That culture didn't come from nowhere. It was taught. It was permitted. It was possibly even rewarded, because the customers it turned away were the ones who didn't look like the commission was worth the trouble, and the ones it welcomed were the ones who looked like they'd signed something by end of day. It was, in its own efficient way, a machine for producing short-term numbers at the cost of long-term trust. Arthur had seen that machine before. He knew what it cost. He drove back to Mississauga that evening and called his assistant to schedule a meeting for the following week. The meeting was held in the Broadfield offices, not the Pinnacle boardroom. Arthur had been specific about that. He'd learned a long time ago that location shaped conversation, and he wanted this conversation shaped a certain way. Less formal, less defensive, more honest. There were 4 people on the Pinnacle side. The regional operations director, a man named Kevin Farr, who had 20 years in automotive retail and a particular brand of confidence that came from never having been wrong in front of people who outranked him. The sales director, a younger woman named Sarah Lindqvist, who had the slightly rigid posture of someone who'd prepared heavily for a meeting she wasn't sure the purpose of. The HR lead, whose name Arthur had already forgotten because the HR lead had not said anything of substance, and the CEO of Pinnacle, a man named Philip Greer, who had built the dealership group from 3 locations in the 90s, and still walked into rooms as though he'd personally carpeted them. Arthur had met Philip Greer twice before at board functions, in the way that major investors sometimes meet the operators of companies they've staked. Politely, briefly, with the mutual understanding that the real relationship was mediated by quarterly reports and counsel letters. Philip had the kind of warm handshake that had probably closed a lot of deals. He used it on Arthur now, along with a smile, and Arthur shook his hand and gestured to the chairs. "I appreciate you making the time," Arthur said. "Of course," Philip said, though I'll admit the agenda was a little light on specifics. "On purpose," Arthur said. He let that sit for a moment. Then he laid a single piece of paper on the table. It was a summary, not a presentation deck, not a report. 1 page, 12-point font, 3 bullet points. He'd written it himself the previous evening. "I visited the Yonge Street location last week," Arthur said. 2 days, as a regular walk-in customer. Philip Greer's expression shifted. Not dramatically, the man had too much practice for that, but something recalibrated behind his eyes. "You visited the showroom." "I did, and I'd like to talk about what I observed, not as an investor making a complaint, as someone who needs to understand what we're actually building before I agree to put more capital into it." There was a silence. Kevin Farr opened his mouth and closed it. Sarah Lindqvist had stopped looking quite so stiff and was now looking quite so still instead, which was a different thing. Arthur didn't describe the interactions dramatically. He didn't perform outrage. He said what he'd seen in the same tone he might use to describe a machine that was running slightly out of alignment, specific, factual, without editorializing. He mentioned Derek Foss by name, not to single him out, but because the pattern needed a face to be real. He mentioned the timing of the service desk responses. He mentioned what he'd noticed about which customers received attention and when. When he finished, Philip said, "I want to be clear that this is not the standard we hold ourselves to." "I believe that," Arthur said. "I believe that's genuinely true of you personally. What I'm saying is that it doesn't match what's happening on the floor. What would you like to see?" Arthur picked up the piece of paper. "These 3 things. The first is a full customer experience audit, third party, unannounced visits across all locations. Not because I expect Yonge Street to be unique, because I don't want to assume it is." He put the paper down. "The second is a review of the floor incentive structure, specifically how commission weighting may be shaping which customers get prioritized." That's a systems problem, not a people problem. You can't fix a systems problem with a training session. He paused. The third is a direct conversation between HR and the showroom staff at Yonge Street. Not a reprimand, a conversation. I want the standard to be stated clearly, not implied. Philip was quiet. Kevin Farr was looking at his hands. And the capital allocation? Philip asked. We'll revisit it after the audit results, Arthur said. 90 days. If the picture is what I think it is, a correctable problem in a fundamentally sound operation, then I'm supportive of the expansion. Genuinely. He closed the folder on the table. I've been in businesses that looked worse on the surface than this. I've also been in businesses that looked better and weren't. What I'm asking for is a real look. Philip Greer nodded slowly. He looked, for the first time in the meeting, like something had been taken from him. Not his authority, not his dignity, but the comfortable version of the story he'd been telling himself about his company. That was usually the most important thing to take, in Arthur's experience. Not the fight, the comfortable version. I'll have Kevin start coordinating with your office on the audit process, Philip said. Good, Arthur said. I'll leave the paper with you. He stood. They all stood. He drove home on the 401 that evening and stopped at the same Tim Hortons on the way. He got the same medium coffee and sat in his car in the parking lot for a few minutes, not thinking about anything specific, just sitting. He thought about his father's watch in the kitchen drawer. He thought about the way Ron Calloway had sat down next to him in the waiting area, not because it was his job, but because something in the man's instincts had said this person is worth talking to, and Ron had trusted that instinct without knowing anything else about him. That was the thing about judgment, Arthur had always thought. It ran in both directions. The version that wrote people off in the first 30 seconds was efficient, but it was expensive in ways that didn't show up on the spreadsheet until it was too late. The version that stayed curious a little longer, that one was slower, less comfortable, harder to train into a culture. But it was the only version that built something worth having. He drove the rest of the way home with the radio off. The audit came back 7 weeks later. Third-party firm out of Toronto. 12 visits across 6 locations, full written report. Arthur read it on a Sunday morning at his kitchen table, with a pot of coffee and no interruptions. It was not what he'd hoped, but it was what he'd expected. The Yonge Street location was not unique. The pattern, differential service, customer profiling by appearance, commission-driven triage, showed up in 4 of the 6 locations to varying degrees. 2 locations were clean. One of them was the smallest location, in a mid-sized Ontario city that most people outside the region had never heard of, staffed almost entirely by people who'd been there longer than a decade. The other was a newer location in Calgary, run by a general manager who had come up from the service department and still remembered what it felt like to be the person no one was watching for. Arthur forwarded the report to Philip Greer on a Monday morning without commentary, then called him that afternoon. You've read it, Arthur said. Yes. Where do you want to start? There was a pause on the line, not hesitation, but something more like recalibration. The kind of pause a man made when he was deciding to stop managing something and start actually looking at it. The incentive structure, Philip said. You were right that it's a systems problem. I should have seen that earlier. You might have seen it if you'd walked in through the front door sometime, Arthur said. Not unkindly. Philip made a sound that was almost a laugh. Probably. The 2 locations that came back clean, Arthur said. I want to understand what they're doing. Not to copy it exactly, context matters, but to understand the logic of it. There's something there worth keeping. I'll set up site visits. Good. Arthur paused. I'll come with you. Another pause. You want to come on the site visits? I'd like to understand what's working before we put a plan together for what isn't. That seems like the right order. There was something in Philip's voice when he answered. Something that hadn't been there before, or maybe something that had been there, but hadn't been turned toward Arthur yet. A kind of respect that wasn't about the capital, the kind that had to be earned differently. All right, Philip said. I'll have my assistant send you the dates. Use my direct line, Arthur said, not the Broadfield main number. He hung up and went to refill his coffee. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, it was one of those late September mornings that Ontario did well. A low yellow light, the kind that made ordinary things look briefly considered, like someone had arranged them on purpose. He stood at the window for a moment, with his mug in both hands. looking out at the yard he never did enough with. He thought about the Yonge Street lobby, about Derek Foss walking away with a brochure he never planned to come back with, about Brittany Coles and her smile that had a direction, about Ron Calloway, who had just sat down, without a reason, because it had seemed like the right thing to do. He thought about the 2 clean locations, the one staffed by people who'd been there long enough to stop performing for the short term, the one run by a man who remembered what it felt like to be invisible. That was the whole of it, really. You couldn't train people to see customers they'd already decided weren't worth seeing. But you could build something where the people doing the work had enough steadiness, enough continuity, enough genuine investment, that they developed the kind of judgment that didn't need the training, the kind that just noticed people. Arthur finished his coffee and rinsed the mug and set it on the drying rack. He had the Calgary site visit on Thursday. He'd take the early flight and be back the same evening. He'd bring the notebook, the real one this time, not the one he'd invented to test Brittany Coles's memory. There were things worth writing down.